I never thought my life would settle into the strange, hollow quiet. A woman of 46, standing alone in a Mountain View villa that once felt like a dream and now felt like a perfectly staged absence. My husband, Anton, had built his business from the ground up, and in doing so, had slowly disappeared from the life he was supposedly building it for. His work trips blurred into each other. 10 days, 16, then 22, until even the calendar stopped mattering. When he did come home, he brought gifts I never asked for and stories I didn't want to hear. We made polite conversation over breakfast like two colleagues who shared a kitchen. Intimacy had long become a museum artifact, something we dusted off in memory, not experience. I kept the house running like a machine. I arranged flowers, cooked balanced meals, answered texts with emojis. I smiled at the neighbors when they passed our iron gate, but most days I felt like a ghost in a perfectly curated portrait. It was late autumn, the trees outside still clung to color, but winter was already in the air when Anton told me he was flying to Zurich for a conference that would probably stretch through most of November. I nodded like I always did. No argument. No questions. Just the usual. Take care of yourself. He left the next morning. And just a few days later, someone else arrived. His nephew, Lucas. 23. Tall, understated, soft-spoken. A final-year architecture student whose mother, Anton's sister, had recently passed away. He asked to stay with us for a week while sorting through her documents. I agreed without hesitation. I'd known Lucas since he was a boy, always reserved but kind, and though we had never been especially close, there had always been a certain quiet comfort in his presence, like an old coat you forget you own until the season turns cold again. But something was different now. Lucas wasn't a boy anymore. He moved through the house like a man. Calm, intentional, composed. The way he looked at me wasn't inappropriate, not exactly. But it was present. Not like Anton, who looked past me. Lucas saw me. When I asked if he wanted coffee, he said, "Only if you have one with me." When I wore a sweater I hadn't pulled out in years, he said, "That color suits you. Makes your eyes sharper." I laughed, embarrassed, brushing it off. But my fingers trembled when I reached for the mug. We began spending time together in those small, accidental ways, folding laundry in silence, listening to jazz while I chopped vegetables, standing side by side as the evening wind crept in through the balcony. I told myself it was just the strange intimacy of grief, the way shared stillness can trick the heart. But I noticed everything. How his shoulder brushed mine and lingered. How he stood just slightly closer each day. And how I didn't step away. One evening, we sat on the upstairs terrace, watching the lights of the valley below flicker like distant lives we didn't belong to. He turned to me and said, "I don't know how you do it. Keep this whole world standing. My uncle barely exists here, and yet you hold everything together." I opened my mouth but said nothing. Praise like that, real, quiet, unexpected, had not found its way to me in a very long time. His voice was steady, but it carried weight. Something inside me shifted. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed for hours, listening to the distant hum of wind chimes and thinking of Lucas's eyes, his voice, the way my name sounded in his mouth, slow, deliberate, not rushed or dismissive like Anton's. I told myself I was overthinking, that it was just attention, just company, just loneliness dressed up as meaning. But deep down, I knew better. I had crossed a line, not physical, not yet, but emotional, undeniably. And it terrified me, because I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. His hand found mine, gently, almost hesitantly, and to my own surprise, I didn't pull away. There was no drama in the moment, no sharp breath or desperate grip. Just stillness. A kind of quiet recognition passed between us, the kind that doesn't ask permission because it already knows the answer. It didn't feel sudden. It felt like we'd been drifting toward this exact point without ever acknowledging it aloud, like two boats carried by the same slow current. Lucas's touch wasn't bold. It wasn't hungry. It was careful, sincere, the kind of contact that doesn't take but offers. And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I wasn't invisible. His gaze didn't just glance across me like everyone else's had for years. It held me, carefully, fully, like he saw every corner of me that had long been gathering dust. Then he leaned closer. I should have stopped him. A voice somewhere inside me whispered it. The voice that belonged to responsibility, to marriage, to everything I thought I stood for. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. Our lips met, slow and deliberate, with none of the recklessness I had always feared in moments like this. There was no rush in it. No fever. Just feeling deep, unspoken, buried, and now exposed. When the kiss ended, neither of us said a word. The silence wasn't cold. It was full. Too full. I stood slowly, told him I was tired, and disappeared upstairs like I could leave the moment behind just by walking away. But sleep never came. I lay awake for hours, the darkness pressing down on me while my mind ran in impossible circles. I had betrayed my husband, not with my body, but with my heart. And somehow that felt worse. Because this wasn't about lust. It wasn't a mistake made in a daze. It was conscious. It was emotional. And a part of me, a quiet, stubborn part one could no longer deny, didn't feel regret. It felt alive. Something inside me had shifted. Like a locked door creaked open after years of silence, and I knew, with aching clarity, that I wouldn't be able to shut it again. The next morning, I dressed carefully, made coffee, and moved through the kitchen like nothing had changed. But everything had. I kept my eyes low, focused on the sound of the kettle. And then I heard his footsteps. Lucas entered casually, greeting me with a calmness that made my stomach twist. He didn't act awkward or uncertain. If anything, there was a new confidence in him, quiet but present, as though the boundary we had crossed hadn't startled him the way it did me. He offered to slice the bread, and I nodded, still not looking at him. We moved around each other in silence, but the tension between us hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Neither of us brought up the kiss, but it lived in the spaces between words, loud in every pause, every gesture, every breath. I kept telling myself it was a moment of weakness. A slip. Something I could will away if I focused hard enough. But when his hand brushed mine again, I didn't flinch. When he reached around me to grab a mug from the shelf, his chest close behind mine, I felt my whole body lean toward the contact before my brain could stop it. Shame and longing pulled at me like twin tides. Later that afternoon, I caught him watching me from the hallway. His eyes weren't casual. They were focused, not hungry, not suggestive, just deeply present. Like he was memorizing me. I hadn't felt that kind of attention in years. Not from Anton. Not from anyone. And that was the danger. Lucas began to linger around the house longer. He stopped mentioning his plans to meet up with friends in the city. Instead, he asked if I wanted company on a walk. Help sorting the attic. Someone to share a film with. Our conversations grew deeper, less about daily routines and more about our pasts. He asked about my old paintings, why I stopped, what I dreamed of when I was his age. No one had asked me questions like that in decades. And the worst part? I wanted to answer him. I wanted to be known again. I tried to establish boundaries. I told him, gently but firmly, that what had happened couldn't happen again. That it was complicated, dangerous, unfair to everyone involved. He listened. He nodded. He even apologized. But that night, when he found me alone in the garden, the sky already dark and the lights inside turned off, he said quietly, "I know I should leave you alone. But I can't stop thinking about you. Not when I see you cry at night and pretend you're fine in the morning. You deserve more than silence." His words didn't feel manipulative. They felt true. And every syllable landed like a careful thread, sewing back together something I hadn't realized was torn beyond recognition. Then, as if testing the air between us, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. "You don't have to pretend anymore," he said, barely above a whisper. "You're allowed to feel again." And I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because the way I looked at him said more than anything I could have spoken. "You don't have to keep pretending," he said again. "You're allowed to feel something. Even now." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The way I looked at him, vulnerable, unguarded, undone, was louder than words. The emotional line had long been crossed. We weren't navigating it anymore. We were standing miles past it, breathless from pretending otherwise. What followed wasn't premeditated. It was quiet, inevitable, like rain that finally touches ground after building for days. I didn't recognize myself. I wasn't the composed woman who folded napkins just right or filled the fridge with fresh herbs. I was someone torn, pulled between guilt and a hunger I had spent years silencing. I told myself I was still in control, that I could rein this in, undo it, pretend it never happened. But the truth was simpler. I had already fallen. And what frightened me more than the risk of being found out was what would happen when he left. Because Lucas would leave. His time here was borrowed. And when he did, when his stay ended, when the bags were packed, when the house was once again mine and mine alone, would he take this version of me with him? The one that had been seen, touched, heard? Or would he leave her behind, unrecognizable and half-broken by something that had never even had the chance to become real? The end came silently. Lucas began packing. He moved slower than usual, folding shirts that once lay crumpled on the couch we had sat on, the air between us thick with things we didn't say anymore. There were no fights, no declarations, just a tension that grew heavier with every passing hour. We had done what we had done. Now we were standing in the aftermath together, yet already apart. I didn't ask him what would happen next. I didn't want promises. I had spent too much of my life choking on promises that were never fulfilled. The night before his departure, he found me in the study. I was pretending to read, the words on the page blurring uselessly. He stood there for a moment, unsure for the first time since all this had begun. He didn't reach for me. He just looked at me, as if trying to memorize my face before it became a memory. "I don't regret anything," he said quietly, "but I don't want to ruin your life either." I nodded. My throat burned. I didn't trust myself to speak. When he left the next morning, there were no dramatic goodbyes. No tears. Just the sound of a suitcase zipper, a front door opening, and the weight of presence turning back into silence. The house was still again. But this time, the stillness felt colder. A few days later, Anton returned, with duty in his eyes and luggage in his hands. He brought chocolates from the airport, talked about mergers and presentations, showed me a photo of a restaurant he said we should try together sometime soon. He didn't notice the way I avoided his gaze. He didn't notice the new silence in me. Maybe he never had. I had given myself to someone else, not just physically, but emotionally, soulfully. And it showed. Maybe not to him. Maybe not on the surface. But to me, it was everywhere. I expected guilt to consume me. I waited for the shame to swallow me whole. But what came instead was something softer, more cruel. Sadness. A deep ache not just for what I had done, but for all the years I had lived without being seen, for the quiet betrayals that came long before mine, for the slow erosion of self that I had allowed in the name of loyalty. Lucas messaged once, "Take care of yourself." I stared at the text for a long time before deleting it. There was nothing else to say. Nothing we could build from what had already been broken. And yet I knew, in the core of me, that I couldn't return to the woman I had been before. Something had changed, and change, once it arrives, doesn't reverse. My marriage survived, technically. The structure stood. But everything inside was hollow, like a house after a fire that somehow didn't burn the walls. Each day, I shared a bed with a man who believed everything was fine. And I carried a silence that weighed more than confession ever could. That, I realized, was the real punishment. Not exposure, not scandal, but endurance. To live with truth in silence. To wear the mask, knowing what lay beneath it. I learned that love without presence is habit, and presence without future is temptation. And somewhere in between, I lost a version of myself I'll never find again.